To help us with finding our purpose in life, let's turn to the book of Jonah. Jonah had a call from God, and I'm telling you what, right off the bat, that must be nice. He knew his purpose in life, he knew his plan, he knew the direction that he was supposed to go in, and I'm telling you, that is privilege. Most of us don't even know what we're called to do. You could be doing it for years and years and years, but you don't know if you're called to do it. You could be studying engineering, but you don't know if you're called. You could be studying architecture, but you don't know if you're called. You could be going into the ministry, but you don't know if you're called by God. Jonah knew. And because of that privilege, he had the time to discern and think about what he was going to do with that call. I mean, if you're starving and you're just trying to figure out where your next meal is coming from, you're not thinking about your purpose in life. So discerning our purpose in life is coming out of a sense of privilege. But more so with Jonah, he resisted his call in life. I mean, it's one thing to know your call, it's another thing to know your call and actually run from it. And that's exactly what Jonah did. He ran as far away from his call as possible. Jonah grabbed a ship, he got on board, and he went to sail the sea. Now, who knows where Jonah thought he was going, but the concept is that Jonah was running as far away from the call, as far away from God as he could possibly get. And what happens when we run away from our call? What happens when we run and resist God? We encounter storms in our lives. For Jonah, it was a storm on the sea. The winds whipped up and there was actually a storm at sea. And we find ourselves in storms all the time. It's the junk, it's the mess that we're in. It could be drama, it could be stress, it could be anxiety, it could be worry. It could be physical, it could be emotional, it could be mental, it could be spiritual, but we find ourselves in storms all the time that we actually create for ourselves. Jonah actually put others at risk. There were sailors on that ship, and the narrator is clear that it's Jonah's fault that the storm had occurred, and so he put the sailors at risk. And sometimes our emotional stress and our anxieties, the things that we worry about, the drama in our own life actually causes storms for others. You know, we could bring other people down with our mess and our junk. And we got to be mindful of that, especially if we try to resist our call. We can run from God, we can run from our purpose, and we can create a storm for ourselves, but we could also create a storm for others. And you might say, you know what? Everything's going well for me. I'm not running from anything. I'm not resisting anything. I sort of have a path in my life, but I'm still in a storm. Maybe it's because you're stuck in someone else's storm. Maybe it's because you're hanging around people who are resisting, running, and not being true to themselves. And so they've got you in their storm. And when storms get really rough, it can be like hell. And for Jonah, he was cast overboard and he found himself in the belly of a fish. That's a tale to let us know that Jonah was hopeless and helpless. He found himself in the middle of nowhere. He couldn't get in, couldn't get out. No one could penetrate this. So he was in hell. Darkness, hopelessness, no one, loneliness, rejection. And the only thing that he could do was to pray. And that's something to remember. When you find yourself in a storm and you hit rock bottom and it gets so bad that it is literal hell for you, God hears our prayer. If you don't know anything else from the book of Jonah, know that God hears our prayer. The problem with the story of Jonah is not the fact that he found himself in a storm. Storms are bad, but that's not the real problem of the story. It's also not a problem that he entered into hell, because he actually was able to escape it by the will of God. The problem is that he was resisting his purpose in life. He was resisting God. And you might say, well, come on, Steve, this is crazy, because how can you resist your purpose in life if you don't know your purpose? But a careful reading of the book of Jonah will show you, at least showed me, that Jonah wasn't necessarily running from what he thought was his purpose in life. Jonah was running from what he was afraid of. Jonah was afraid of Nineveh. Nineveh is a stock character in this story. It's just meant to let us know nothing about the city, nothing about Assyria, nothing about the history. It's to let us know that Jonah ran away from what he was fearful of. Now ask yourself this. What are we running from? What are you running from? We often run from our fears. It could be the fear of change. It could be the fear of rejection. We could have the fear of judgment. You know, if we fear failure, we don't start anything. If we fear judgment, we don't show our true side. If we fear rejection, we don't invest into others. We can fear loss. We can fear anxiety itself. We can fear fear itself. One of the biggest things in our life is the fact that we fear inadequacy. I think that's what Jonah was thinking. Jonah probably felt that he wasn't worthy to have a call. He wasn't worthy to be on God's good side. That why would God want anything out of Jonah? But when Jonah ran from his fear, he was actually opting out on the potential that God had him, because God wasn't going to call Jonah to something that Jonah couldn't do. And you are not called to anything that you can't do. You're only called to the things that God sees the potential in you having the potential to do. So think about this for a second. Imagine for a second that we're running from our fears. And by running from our fears, we're running from our purpose in life. And by running from our purpose in life, we're running from God. But you know what? There's no sense in running from God, because hiding from God is impossible. So we might as well side with God. I don't think Jonah ever imagined that running from his fear, that he would encounter a storm and hell in his life. He probably only thought by going to the fear that he would encounter a storm and hell, but the inverse happened. And God's persistence met Jonah's resistance twofold. Because in chapter 3, God calls Jonah again. Because that's who God is. God continues to call us. The more we run, the more God calls. It's not an invitation to run or resist from God. All that does is exhaust us and make us tired. God calls us to live in the potential that we have been given, because God sees worth in us. There's no sense in being fearful of being inadequate. And that's something I struggle with every day. That's a hard pill to swallow, because almost every day I wonder if I'm truly worthy. But it's not up to me to worry about whether or not I'm worthy, because God has called me as worthy, and God has called you. God sees you for the potential that you have. The God created, given self that you have has a call in this life. Jonah never imagined that God had need of him. And because of that, he opted out on what God had blessed him to do. Jonah never imagined that by resisting God, that he would be met by God's full force persistence. So I'll leave you with this. Imagine this. Imagine that you are literally in the same boat as Jonah. You're avoiding, you're resisting, you're running from your fears, your potential, your call from God. But God still finds worth in you and says, stop running. Face the fear. Live in to your call.